The weekend gathering was meant to be special. People talked about it as if it were something important, something worth dressing up for and remembering. The countryside estate stood far from the noise of the city, surrounded by wide fields and tall trees that looked calm and proud. The building itself was old, with large windows and stone walls that carried years of quiet stories. Inside, everything looked polished and expensive, as if nothing messy or ordinary was allowed to exist there. Cars arrived one after another. Guests stepped out wearing neat clothes, confident smiles, and an air of belonging. They greeted each other loudly, laughing before jokes were even finished. Compliments were exchanged quickly, almost like a habit. The house slowly filled with voices, the smell of rich food and soft music playing somewhere in the background. Among all these people was a woman most hardly noticed. She arrived quietly without drawing attention. She was in her late 50s, wearing simple clothes that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. Her cardigan had been washed many times, and her shoes were practical, not shiny. There was nothing about her that demanded attention, and that was exactly why she blended into the room so easily. Her name was Eleanor. She didn't rush to greet anyone or try to join conversations. She stood near the side of the room, holding a glass she barely touched. Her posture was relaxed, not nervous. She wasn't uncomfortable being alone. In fact, she seemed used to it. Eleanor had learned long ago that watching quietly often told you more than speaking loudly. She observed the room with calm eyes, noticing small things others missed. She saw how people laughed louder when someone important was nearby. She noticed how compliments sounded warm on the surface but empty underneath. She saw how some guests kept checking their phones, pretending to listen while waiting for a chance to talk about themselves. None of this bothered her. It simply was what it was. She had not grown up in places like this. Her life had been simple, filled with routine work, early mornings, and quiet evenings. She knew the feel of soil under her nails and the comfort of silence after a long day. Fancy gatherings were not part of her world, but she didn't resent them either. She just didn't belong to them. As she stood there, her eyes wandered around the room, passing over paintings, furniture, and decorations that looked expensive but distant. Then her gaze stopped. In the far corner of the drawing room stood a grand piano. It was large and once beautiful, but now clearly forgotten. A thin layer of dust covered its surface, dulling its shine. Some of the keys were chipped, and a few were missing altogether, leaving uneven gaps. The bench in front of it looked unused, slightly pushed aside as if no one had sat there in years. The piano didn't match the rest of the room. Everything else seemed carefully maintained, but this instrument felt abandoned. It wasn't there to be played anymore. It was there to look impressive, to remind people of a refined past. Eleanor felt something pull at her attention. She didn't move toward it right away. She simply looked at it from where she stood, her expression softening. There was no sadness in her eyes, just recognition. She had always noticed things that were overlooked, things that carried quiet stories. As conversations continued around her, Eleanor slowly walked closer to the piano. No one noticed. Everyone was too busy talking, laughing, or trying to be seen. She stopped a short distance away and studied it carefully. She imagined the piano years ago, its keys bright and whole, its sound filling the room. She imagined hands moving across it, practicing, making mistakes, trying again. She wondered who had last played it and why it had been left like this. Her fingers twitched lightly as if remembering something old. Music had once been part of her life, long before responsibility and routine took over. She had not played on grand stages or in fine houses. She had played in small rooms, for herself mostly, finding comfort in sound when words failed. Life had slowly pushed that part of her aside, but it had never completely left. The piano felt familiar, even in its broken state. She reached out and gently touched the wood, careful, respectful. The surface felt cool under her fingers. She didn't press any keys yet. She simply rested her hand there for a moment, like greeting someone she hadn't seen in a long time. A voice nearby broke the calm. Someone laughed loudly, followed by several others. The sound felt sharp against the quiet moment Eleanor had been having. She withdrew her hand slightly but stayed near the piano, still drawn to it. Across the room, the host's son stood surrounded by listeners. He spoke with confidence, enjoying the attention. His words were smooth, practiced, and filled with opinions he believed were important. He talked about art, culture, and music as if he owned those subjects. Eleanor didn't listen closely. She had heard people like him before. People who spoke about beauty without ever really listening to it. Still, as she stood near the piano, she felt something settle inside her. A sense of calm, steady, and warm. She didn't know why she was there or what would happen next. She wasn't planning anything. She was simply present. The room continued to buzz with energy, but around Eleanor, time seemed to slow. She took a deep breath, letting the sounds wash over her. The piano remained silent, waiting. She had no idea that soon, every eye in the room would turn toward her. For now, she was just a quiet woman standing near a broken piano, unseen and underestimated, listening to a space where something had once lived. And sometimes, that is where the most important stories begin. The evening slowly moved forward, and the mood inside the house grew louder and more careless. Glasses were refilled again and again. Voices rose as people became more comfortable, or maybe more interested in being heard. Laughter came easily now, sometimes for real reasons, sometimes for none at all. The room felt full, not just with people, but with opinions, pride, and quiet competition. Eleanor stayed where she was, near the piano. She hadn't planned to stand there for so long, but something kept her rooted. The instrument felt like a small island of calm in a sea of noise. She didn't touch it again. She simply remained close, her presence gentle and unnoticed, across the room. The host's son continued to hold attention like it was his right. He spoke about music now, his voice confident and sharp. He talked about famous performances, flawless technique, and how real talent meant never making mistakes. His words sounded impressive, especially to those who didn't know much about music themselves. Emotion is overrated, he said with a slight laugh. Anyone can feel something. Precision, that's what separates professionals from amateurs. A few people nodded eagerly. Others laughed, wanting to agree. As he spoke, his eyes moved across the room, scanning faces. Then they landed on Eleanor. She stood quietly near the piano, hands relaxed at her sides, listening without reacting. Her simple clothes and calm posture didn't fit the image of someone who should be standing next to such an instrument. To him, she looked out of place. And out of place in his mind meant unimportant. A small smile appeared on his face. Not warm, not kind. It was the kind of smile that comes when someone thinks they are about to entertain themselves. He raised his voice slightly. You there, he said, gesturing toward Eleanor. You seem quite interested in the piano. The room's attention shifted. Conversations paused. Several people turned to look at her for the first time that evening. Eleanor felt the shift, but didn't flinch. She looked up calmly. They say a true artist can create beauty anywhere, he continued, stepping closer to the piano. Even from something broken. A few people chuckled softly. Why don't you show us? He said, Go on. Play something for us. There was a brief silence, followed by quiet laughter. Someone nearby added, That thing hasn't worked in years? Another voice said, It's completely broken. The words floated in the air, light on the surface, heavy underneath. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test, meant to embarrass. All eyes were now on Eleanor. For a moment, the room waited for her to refuse. That was what everyone expected. A polite smile, a small shake of the head, maybe an apology. That would have ended it, but Eleanor didn't feel panic. She didn't feel anger either. She felt calm. She understood what was happening, but she also understood something else. She had spent most of her life being underestimated. She had learned that silence did not mean weakness, and simplicity did not mean emptiness. She gave a small nod. Not dramatic. Not hesitant. Just a quiet acceptance. The laughter faded, replaced by confusion. People leaned forward slightly, unsure of what they were about to witness. Eleanor walked toward the piano with steady steps. Each movement was unhurried, natural. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she stood beside the instrument, placing her hand on its surface again. The room was quiet enough now that even that soft touch felt meaningful. She lifted the lid carefully, as if respecting something fragile. Then she pressed a single key. The sound was dull and uneven. She pressed another. A sharp, unpleasant twang followed. A few people exchanged looks. Someone smiled, expecting the moment to end in failure, but Eleanor kept going. She tested one key at a time, listening closely. She wasn't checking for what was wrong. She was discovering what still worked. One key produced a clear, gentle sound. Standing out among the others like a voice in a crowd, her face didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Focus replaced distance. Memory replaced hesitation. She closed her eyes briefly. The room felt different now. The challenge had lost its humor. The host's son stood back, arms crossed, his expression slowly tightening. This was taking longer than he expected. Eleanor finally sat down. She adjusted the bench slightly, then rested her hands above the keys without touching them. For a second, it looked like she might stop, like she might decide not to go through with it, but then her fingers moved, not quickly, not loudly. The first notes were simple, spaced apart. The melody formed slowly, built from the few keys that still responded. The broken ones became spaces. Silence became part of the music. People stopped smiling. The sound filled the room in a way no one expected. It wasn't polished or perfect, but it was honest. The strange tones didn't feel wrong. They felt intentional, like emotion finding its own path. The host's son lowered his arms. His confident posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly, as if trying to understand what he was hearing. Eleanor played as if she were alone. There was no performance in her body, no need for approval. Her shoulders were relaxed, her breathing steady. Each note carried care. The music told a quiet story. Of time passing, of things breaking and still being useful, of voices that aren't loud but stay with you. The room was completely silent now. No whispers, no laughter, no movement. Everyone listened. And as the melody continued, something began to change. Not just in the sound, but in the people hearing it. Faces softened, eyes focused, judgments paused. What had started as a cruel challenge was no longer a joke. It had become something real. And Eleanor, the woman who had arrived unseen, was now impossible to ignore. The melody continued to flow through the room, slow and gentle, like a quiet conversation that didn't need words. Eleanor's fingers moved carefully, choosing each note with intention. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply listening and responding, letting the piano guide her instead of forcing it to obey. The broken keys created gaps, and she let those gaps breathe. Where sound failed, silence spoke. The pauses felt meaningful, almost emotional, like moments in life when nothing can be said but everything is felt. Each imperfect note seemed to carry weight, as if it had waited years to be heard. People in the room began to shift in their seats. Some leaned forward without realizing it. Others lowered their heads slightly, as though listening more closely would help them understand what they were feeling. No one checked their phone. No one whispered. It was as if time had slowed just enough for everyone to notice it. Eleanor's face remained calm, but her eyes were alive with focus. Memories moved through her, not loudly, not painfully, but gently. She remembered evenings long ago when music was the only place she felt truly understood. She remembered playing softly so she wouldn't disturb anyone, learning to make beauty without asking for permission. Those memories shaped the way her hands moved. Now the piano responded in its own way. Some notes rang clear and full, others cracked or faded too quickly. Instead of fighting those sounds, Eleanor welcomed them. She adjusted her touch, slowed her pace, changed direction. It felt less like playing an instrument and more like having a conversation with something old and tired. Something that still wanted to speak across the room. Faces that once held amusement now showed something closer to wonder. People who had arrived confident and loud were suddenly quiet, unsure of themselves. The energy in the room had changed. It was no longer about being seen. It was about feeling something real. The host's son stood frozen, his earlier smile long gone. He didn't look angry. He looked unsettled. His carefully built opinions about talent and perfection were being challenged in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't technical brilliance. This was something deeper, something harder to dismiss. Eleanor reached a point in the melody where only two keys were working close together. She repeated them slowly, letting the sound echo, then fade. The repetition felt steady, comforting, like a heartbeat. With each pass, the room seemed to sink further into the music. Someone near the back quietly wiped their eyes, surprised by the emotion rising inside them. Another person pressed their lips together, holding back something they didn't fully understand. The music wasn't sad, but it wasn't happy either. It was honest. And honesty has a way of touching places people keep hidden. As Eleanor played, she became less aware of the room. The stares, the expectations, the challenge that had started it all faded away. There was only the piano and the sound they were making together. Her breathing matched the rhythm. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. She didn't rush toward an ending. She let the melody find its own conclusion. When the final note came, it was soft and brief. It didn't announce itself. It simply existed for a moment, then disappeared into the quiet. No one moved. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't awkward or empty. It was full, heavy with feeling. The kind of silence that asks people to sit with what they've just experienced. Eleanor slowly lifted her hands from the keys. She didn't bow. She didn't look around to see reactions. She stood up gently, as if afraid to disturb the moment. She placed her hand on the piano one last time. Not in pride, but in gratitude. Then she turned and walked back toward the corner of the room where she had been standing earlier. Still, no one spoke. Finally, someone began to clap. It was hesitant at first, a single pair of hands breaking the stillness. Then another joined. And another. Soon the room filled with applause, not loud and showy, but deep and sincere. It was the kind of applause that came from respect rather than excitement. Eleanor stopped for a moment, surprised. She turned slightly, offering a small smile, nothing more. Her face held peace, not triumph. She hadn't come to change the room. She had simply shared something true. The host's son clapped too, though his hands moved slower than the others. His expression was thoughtful now, stripped of confidence. He didn't meet her eyes. As the applause faded, people slowly returned to themselves, but something lingered. Conversations didn't resume right away. When they did, they were quieter, more thoughtful. The room no longer felt like a place to perform. It felt human. Eleanor returned to her spot, holding her glass again, though she still didn't drink from it. A few guests glanced at her, curious, unsure whether to speak. Some nodded politely. Others smiled with new warmth. She didn't mind the attention, but she didn't seek it either. For her, the moment was already complete. The piano sat quietly in the corner once more, unchanged in appearance but transformed in meaning. It was no longer just a broken object collecting dust. It was a reminder that beauty doesn't always come from perfection. And voices don't need to be loud to be heard. Eleanor looked at it one last time, then turned her gaze toward the window, where the night had settled softly over the countryside. Inside the room, nothing looked different, but everything had changed. The applause slowly faded, but the feeling in the room stayed. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, the kind that sits gently on the chest. People looked at one another differently now, as if something private had been shared between strangers. No one rushed to speak. No one wanted to break the moment too quickly. Eleanor stood near the corner again, her posture relaxed. She held her glass loosely, still untouched. She felt no rush of pride, no need to explain herself. What she had done felt complete, like a sentence spoken at the right time and then allowed to rest. Across the room, the host's son remained unusually quiet. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier seemed to have drained away. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly unsure of what to do next. The performance he had expected to mock had turned into something he couldn't control. A few guests slowly began moving again, careful and thoughtful, like people waking from a dream. Soft conversations started, but they were different now, less loud, less performative. People spoke with more care, choosing their words instead of throwing them into the air. One older guest leaned toward another and whispered, "I didn't know music like that could come from a piano in that state." Another replied quietly, "I don't think it was the piano. I think it was her." Eleanor heard none of this. She was looking toward the window, where the night sky stretched dark and wide over the countryside. Small lights flickered in the distance, and the world outside felt calm and steady, unchanged by what had just happened inside the room. For Eleanor, the moment had stirred memories not loudly but gently. She thought of the years when music had been her companion, times when life felt heavy and sound was the only way to release what words couldn't hold. She remembered practicing late at night, fingers sore, heart full. She remembered giving it up, not in anger, but slowly as responsibility took over. She had never regretted it. Life had given her other things. But standing at that piano had reminded her that those parts of her never truly disappear. They simply wait. A woman nearby approached her with a soft smile. "That was beautiful," she said, her voice sincere. "I've never heard anything like it." Eleanor nodded politely. "Thank you," she replied, simple and warm. The woman hesitated, then added, "Did you study music?" Eleanor smiled gently. "A long time ago," she said, "and not in places like this." The woman seemed to understand. She squeezed Eleanor's arm lightly before returning to her group. More guests began to acknowledge her now. Some offered quiet compliments. Others simply nodded with respect. No one asked her to play again. They sensed that asking would somehow lessen what had already been given. The host's son finally stepped forward. His face showed something close to humility, though he struggled to wear it comfortably. He stopped a short distance away, clearing his throat. "I didn't expect that," he said, choosing his words carefully. Eleanor looked at him calmly, without judgment. "That piano—" "It sounded different," he continued. Eleanor replied softly, "It always had a voice. It just needed someone to listen." He nodded, not fully sure what to say next. After a moment, he stepped back, allowing the conversation to end where it was. The piano remained in the corner, unchanged in form but changed in meaning. A few guests glanced at it now with curiosity instead of dismissal. Some moved closer, studying the keys, the worn wood, as if seeing it for the first time. The evening continued, but the atmosphere never returned to what it had been. The noise stayed lower. The laughter became more real. People spoke less about themselves and listened a little more to others. As the night wore on, coats were collected and goodbyes were said. One by one, guests began to leave, stepping back into the cool countryside air. The house slowly emptied, its grand rooms returning to stillness. Eleanor gathered her things quietly. No one stopped her, no one made a scene. She preferred it that way. Before leaving, she paused once more near the piano. The room was nearly empty now, the lights dimmer. She placed her hand on the instrument gently, as she had before. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom. Outside, the night air felt fresh against her face. She walked down the long driveway, her footsteps steady and light. There was no applause now, no audience, no expectations, just peace. She knew she would return to her simple routines. Early mornings, quiet work, ordinary days. Nothing about her life would change in a way others could see, but inside, something had settled. The broken piano had spoken, and through it, so had she. And sometimes there's more than enough. The next morning arrived quietly, without any sign of what had happened the night before. The countryside looked the same as always. Mist rested lightly on the fields, and birds moved through the trees without hurry. Life had a way of continuing, no matter how powerful a moment might feel. Eleanor woke early as she always did. Habit guided her more than alarm clocks. She made herself a simple cup of tea and stood by the window of the small room where she had stayed overnight. The memory of the piano returned gently, not as excitement but as warmth. It felt less like something she had done and more like something that had passed through her. She didn't replay the scene in her mind. She didn't imagine what others might be saying about her. That kind of thinking had never interested her. For Eleanor, moments mattered only while they were alive. Once they passed, she let them rest. She packed her bag neatly, folded her cardigan, and checked the room to make sure she had left nothing behind. The house was quiet now. The polished floors echoed softly under her steps as she walked toward the exit. A few staff members moved about, preparing for the day, but no one stopped her. Before leaving, she glanced once more toward the drawing room. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the piano rested in the same corner, silent and still. Sunlight from the tall windows touched its surface, revealing the dust and worn keys without judgment. For a brief moment, Eleanor considered walking in. But she didn't. Some things don't need to be repeated. She stepped outside and began her journey home. The road stretched ahead, familiar and unremarkable, just the way she liked it. By the time she reached her small house, the world had already moved on. Neighbors went about their routines. Shops opened. Children passed by, laughing loudly. No one knew what had happened the night before, and that was fine. Eleanor returned to her daily life without any dramatic changes. She tended her garden, her hands sinking into the soil with comfort. She cooked simple meals and ate them slowly. In the evenings, she sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling down. Yet something had shifted inside her. She found herself humming more often. Small melodies rose without effort, especially while working. Sometimes she tapped rhythms on the table or the arm of her chair. Music had slipped back into her life, not as ambition but as companionship. Days later, news of the evening quietly traveled through certain circles. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just small mentions here and there. Did you hear about that woman? Someone would say, she played a broken piano. It was unforgettable. But Eleanor never heard these stories. She wasn't looking for them. Back at the estate, the piano was no longer ignored. One afternoon, the host walked into the drawing room alone. He stood in front of the instrument, studying it with a new kind of attention. Where he once saw an object, he now felt a presence. He pressed a key. It still sounded broken, but now it sounded honest. He arranged for the piano to be repaired, not fully restored, but carefully tended. Some keys were left as they were. The technician questioned this choice, but the host insisted. It doesn't need to be perfect, he said. It just needs to be itself. When the repairs were done, the piano still carried its scars, but it was alive again. At the next gathering, no one mocked it. No one used it as decoration. Someone played it softly in the background, not to impress, but to fill the space with warmth. The room felt different, more grounded. And without realizing it, the people there listened more than they spoke. As for the host's son, the moment stayed with him longer than he expected. His confidence returned eventually, but it changed shape. He spoke less and listened more. When he talked about music, he paused before making judgments. Once, someone mentioned technical perfection. He didn't agree or disagree. He simply said, "There's more to it than that." Eleanor never returned to the estate. She didn't need to. What she had shared there was complete. It belonged to the moment, not to a place. One evening, months later, Eleanor found herself clearing an old cupboard. Behind boxes and unused items, she discovered a small keyboard she had forgotten she owned. Several keys were cracked. Some didn't work at all. She smiled. She placed it on the table, wiped it clean, and pressed a key. The sound was uneven, imperfect, and beautiful. She played for herself that night, not thinking about anyone else. The room filled with soft, broken music, and Eleanor felt completely at peace. Sometimes the world doesn't need grand performances or perfect instruments. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to listen and brave enough to play anyway.